One bank has more power over America than most people realize, and the truth is both unsettling and strangely poetic. You feel something like Datu Zu when you watch a few faces move between trading floors and government halls, because those faces are part of a system that quietly shapes policy and profit. The scene opens with a line you already heard somewhere, whispered in print and online. That sense of concentrated influence that reads like a warning and a boast. As you watch the story unfold, you begin to recognize patterns of power, because once you see the revolving door, you cannot unsee it. Act 1 begins with the earliest days of Goldman Sachs, when the firm started as a small commercial paper business in 1869 and slowly became a Wall Street titan. You should imagine a long arc of ambition, where a handful of partners built relationships that would later be weaponized into global influence and financial innovation. Goldman thrived because it learned to be indispensable to governments and corporations alike, arranging deals, underwriting debt, and advising on mergers across decades. You start to see a culture take shape, one where loyalty to the firm and intellectual rigor were rewarded with opportunity and secrecy. The culture of Goldman Sachs has its own mythology, and you will quickly understand it as more than corporate branding or simple pride. From the beginning, there was an obsessive focus on talent, ambition, and an almost academic approach to market problems that created both brilliance and a ruthless streak. As you consider that culture, you should also notice the language the firm used. A language of service and destiny that sometimes crossed into hubris. That hubris would later produce remarks like, "doing God's work," a phrase attributed to Lloyd Blankfein that revealed how powerful people sometimes interpret profit as moral purpose. But here's where it gets interesting, because being an investment bank was only the first part of Goldman's story, and the second part involved government. You feel the chill when you realize that Goldman didn't just make money from markets. It made power from relationships with regulators and elected officials. You will meet names that read like a who is who of American economic policy. And those names were not accidental hires, but strategic placements. That posture of influence transformed Goldman from a bank into a political operator, and gave it leverage most corporations could only dream about. You should know some of the people who walked that path because their choices rewired American policy on several occasions, starting with Robert Rubin, who left Goldman to become Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration. You feel the significance when you realize the same networks that underwrote major deals were now shaping tax, regulatory, and international monetary policy. Then you see Henry Paulson, who traded private sector power for public authority at the Treasury during the run. Up to the 2008 crisis, and you start to understand how temperament and allegiance can travel across institutions. Each example of that revolving door tightened the web between Wall Street and Washington in ways that few voters ever perceived. There were other notable Goldmans who took public office, including John Corzine, who traded Goldman partnership for a Senate seat and later the New Jersey governorship. You feel a double take when you consider that these career moves allowed private strategies to influence public decision, making in subtle and not so subtle ways. Later figures like Steve Mnuchin also illustrate the modern iteration of this pipeline, moving from Goldman-linked investment vehicles into the Treasury under President Trump. You begin to see the pattern: the bank grooms insiders, who then become public stewards, and then sometimes return to the private sector richer in connections and privilege. What happened next will shock you, because the 2008 financial crisis showed in stark relief how that revolving door actually mattered. You will feel the tension when the private knowledge and the public authority intersected during frantic months of bailouts, emergency meetings, and policy improvisations. Goldman played multiple roles in that saga, as market maker, advisor, and counterparty, and those roles created conflicts that still matter today. The way Goldman operated during the crisis would later spawn scandals, investigations, and a public backlash that gave the firm a notorious reputation. You should remember specific allegations about Goldman during 2008, including claims that the bank shorted securities that it had packaged and sold to clients as safe investments. You feel a moral dissonance because on one hand the firm profited, and on the other hand those same products destroyed client, capital, and public confidence. The most infamous example was the Abacus deal, where investors alleged Goldman misled clients while betting against the same mortgage securities. That case would lead to a high-profile settlement with Asechi and Mark, a turning point in how the public perceived Wall Street ethics. But here is another layer that most people never see, because rescue operations during the crisis were complicated and often opaque, and you should care about who benefited from government backstops. You feel the irony when you realize the AAG bailout functioned in many ways as a backdoor rescue for Goldman and other large counterparties. Goldman was counterparty to AAG and received cash through government arrangements that stabilized the firm while public anger swelled over the perception of preferential treatment. The bailout conversation turned into a debate about systemic risk and whether certain firms were truly deemed too big to fail because of their political ties. You have to understand how the Abacus suit and the AIG rescue together shaped a narrative that framed Goldman as both predator and protected elite. You feel the public outrage crystallize when Rolling Stone published its now famous vampire squid metaphor that stuck to the firm like a stain. That Rolling Stone phrase captured the popular imagination because it sounded visceral and irreverent in describing a firm that seemed to feed off markets and governments. You begin to see how reputation can be weaponized in politics when a single article becomes shorthand for systemic critique. The scandals didn't T-stop in 2008, and you should know that Goldman was implicated in a string of controversies that extended globally. You feel the pattern of influence and opportunism when you look at Greece, where Goldman reportedly helped disguise national debt to allow entry into the Eurozone. That Greek saga involved creative financial engineering that masked liabilities through swaps and other instruments, and later revelations suggested those deals came at a heavy cost to taxpayers. You begin to understand how expertise in complex finance can be used to circumvent rules and reshape political options for sovereign nations. What happened in Greece raises questions about consent and accountability because sovereign debt is ultimately a public contract, and the public deserved clearer disclosure. You feel the moral unease when you realize that the instruments created to stabilize markets can also obscure governance and democratic oversight. Those Greek deals were symptomatic of a broader approach where financial innovation prioritized client advantage, often at the expense of transparency. You should ask yourself whether technical mastery should ever substitute for public deliberation and legal clarity. Another scandal that exposed global reach and moral hazard was the 1MDB affair, where allegations tied large financial flows to political corruption in Malaysia and to major banks' advisory roles. You feel the scale of the scandal when you see how billions of dollars apparently funneled through complex structures and offshore entities. Goldman faced heavy scrutiny for its role in arranging bond deals that were later alleged to have been misused, and that led to fines and reputational fallout. This episode showed how emerging markets and institutional expertise combined to create opportunities for abuse when oversight was weak. You should also consider how commodities and electronic trading controversies contributed to Goldman's controversial image, because manipulation allegations came from multiple corners. You feel the breadth of suspicion when regulators and plaintiffs alleged schemes that distorted prices and harmed consumers, whether in metals, energy, or agricultural markets. Critics argued that traders used scale and secrecy to move markets and capture rents. Those patterns reinforce the narrative that Goldman was often willing to bend rules for profit when oversight was murky or enforcement lagged behind innovation. A pattern emerges as you step back and view Goldman's strategy over decades: cultivate talent, embed in power, and innovate in ways that outpace regulation. You feel a cold efficiency in this logic because it treats political and regulatory systems as variables to be optimized. That optimization has consequences because when the bank wins, its clients sometimes lose, and when the bank loses, taxpayers often pay. You begin to see why critics argue that Goldman doesn't just play the game, it reshapes the rules to its advantage. But here is the paradox you must confront, which is that Goldman often framed its influence as expertise in service of markets and national interest. You feel the rhetorical power of that frame because expertise comforts policymakers and can justify outsized roles during crises. When officials with Goldman backgrounds argued for certain rescue packages or regulatory translations, they did so from the position of insider knowledge and practical experience. That insider status created a credibility advantage that often trumped skepticism and alternative voices. You will now look at how regulatory capture functions, because influence is rarely a single transaction and more often a long-term accumulation of relationships. You feel the slow, accumulatory capture when you chart donations, alumni networks, and advisory positions across decades. Lobbying and campaign contributions are visible tools, but the subtler mechanisms like policy reports, think tank funding, and personnel exchanges are often more consequential. That ecosystem normalizes industry perspectives in policy debates and narrows the range of acceptable solutions for public crises. You should also be aware of how politicians and administrations benefit from Goldman expertise, because sometimes crisis management requires technical competence that few possess. You feel conflicted when competence and conflict of interest begin to look like interchangeable justifications in public debates. Under both Republican and Democratic administrations, Goldman alumni have occupied key economic posts, and that bipartisan pipeline suggests systemic reliance rather than partisan favoritism. That bipartisan pattern raises difficult questions about accountability and whether governance systems can remain impartial when built from industry alumni. What might surprise you is how often the bank's influence is exercised through quiet institutional mechanisms rather than bold displays of power. You feel the texture of that subtlety when you consider research reports, private briefings, and confidential negotiation rooms, where few observers are invited. These backstage maneuvers shape policy outcomes incrementally, which makes them harder to contest. Small concessions and technical rule changes accumulate into a landscape that often privileges the sophisticated over the democratic. You should also consider the personal incentives involved because the financial rewards for alumni returning to private life are enormous and often incentivize loyalty to prior clients. You feel how compensation structures distort incentives when former officials are offered lucrative roles that reward political favoritism in indirect ways. That dynamic perpetuates the cycle because the promise of future wealth influences decisions made while in office. You begin to appreciate why reforms that focus solely on disclosure rarely change the underlying incentives that promote capture. But what about regulation and enforcement, you might ask? And the answer is complex, because institutions meant to police markets are themselves under political pressure. You feel the tension when enforcement agencies fluctuate in intensity depending on budget, leadership, and political appetite. Goldman weathered investigations and fines, and often continued to expand despite penalties that critics called insufficient. Those outcomes reinforce the perception that the bank can absorb legal costs as the price of doing business while maintaining its strategic advantages. You should not imagine the bank as monolithic or purely villainous because within such large organizations, there are people who have diverse motives and ethics. You feel nuanced when you recognize that some employees push for compliance and restraint, while others focus on revenue and innovation. That internal tension can produce reforms at times, but it can also create plausible deniability when things go wrong. Understanding that duality helps explain why change is difficult and why critics must be both precise and persistent. As you near the end of this investigation, you should ask a fundamental question about democracy and finance, because concentrated expertise often intersects with concentrated wealth in ways that matter for civic life. You feel urgency when you imagine policy dominated by practitioners whose incentives differ from the public good. If power without accountability becomes normalized, then market logic can displace democratic deliberation in key policy areas. That prospect demands new thinking about conflict mitigation, transparency, and institutional independence. What happens next will shock you, because despite scandal and scrutiny, Goldman remains an integral part of the global financial system, and that continuity matters for ordinary people. You feel the paradox that power can survive reputation shocks because networks and necessity often trump morality in high finance. Today, the bank retains access to senior officials and plays advisory roles in central decisions on policy, trade, and international finance. That enduring influence means its behavior still matters to markets, pensions, and national economies across the globe. You should also notice how the firm has adapted its narrative after scandals, emphasizing compliance and corporate responsibility while maintaining core trading businesses. You feel the careful choreography of corporate communication when the messaging shifts to resilience and lessons learned without ceding strategic advantage. This public pivot helps rebuild trust with stakeholders while quietly preserving the bank's most profitable functions. That skill at reputational management is part of why Goldman continually recovers and why it remains central to both markets and policy circles. You should not be surprised that Goldman will remain influential in future administrations because the skill sets it teaches are in high demand among policymakers who face complex economic crises. You feel the inevitability when you consider that governments need expertise to manage monetary and fiscal emergencies, and banks often supply the talent. The critical question is whether institutional designs can be reformed so expertise does not equate to capture. Without structural change, you should expect current dynamics to persist and influence choices that affect millions of citizens. In conclusion, you have watched a story of ambition, ingenuity, and systemic imbalance that reveals much about modern capitalism and governance. You feel a complex mixture of admiration for the intellectual gifts and concern for the asymmetries of power that produced repeated scandals and outsized influence. Goldman Sachs did not become the bank that rules Wall Street and Washington by accident. It did so through strategy, relationships, and an ability to position itself as indispensable. The lesson you should take away is that power tolerated without accountability reshapes institutions in ways that ultimately determine public life. If this gave you a new perspective on power, the last thought to carry forward is a philosophical question about whose interest policy should serve. You feel the weight of that query because the answer determines whether democracy can check concentrated financial influence. When expertise becomes a cover for unaccountable power, citizens must demand both better rules and stronger institutions to restore balance. That is the civic task before you and before every voter who wants markets to serve public life rather than the other way around. If you walked away with one concrete action, it would be to support transparency reforms that limit conflicts of interest and the revolving door. You feel empowered when you realize that policy change can originate from informed citizens demanding ethical boundaries, rather than accepting business as usual. This is not about demonizing an entire industry, but about creating guardrails that prevent captured governance. When you advocate for those changes, you contribute to a system that might better balance expertise and democratic accountability. If this story resonated with you, then consider digging deeper into the cases we mentioned, including Abacus, the Greek debt swaps, and the 1MDB investigations. You feel equipped when you know where to look, because primary documents and investigative reporting reveal the mechanisms of power more clearly than hot takes. Make time to read the Rolling Stone piece that coined the vampire squid, phrase and the SEC filings related to Abacus to see the legal reasoning in action. Understanding the evidence helps you move from outrage to informed critique and meaningful civic engagement. Finally, if you want to see these power dynamics change, you should join conversations about campaign finance, regulatory independence, and transparent hiring practices for public offices. You feel agency when you realize these are policy choices that can be altered through democracy and sustained advocacy. The work is messy and slow, but it is far more reliable than waiting for market actors to police themselves. If you care about how markets and governments interact, then this is the moment to get involved and insist on structural reforms. And if this video gave you a new perspective or simply moved you to think differently, consider subscribing so we can keep exploring these complicated stories together. You feel part of a community when you commit to learning and questioning the institutions that shape public life. If you value clarity and investigative depth, hit subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about future videos that explore power, money, and policy. Thank you for watching and for caring about how the world is shaped by forces you now understand a little better.